see, we've discussed a number of things, and there's still quite a few to go into. Now, I thought maybe I'd say a little more about a few other things before we come back to. So we've discussed proprioception yesterday quite a bit, and I understand some people still feel it's not clear. But the basic point is that you're really aware of how your body is moving and so on. See, like I was reading, somebody, there was one, he had something happen to him, I forget what, but he felt the right side of his body didn't belong to him or something, that he wasn't aware of it as his own. You see. That's the sort of thing that's involved in proprioception. You're aware of this whole thing as belonging to you and part of you, and you're aware of what's happening and how what you intend affects it and so on. Whereas if you watch the tree moving, you see you're aware that's quite independent. And in fact, according to Piaget, the psychologist study children, young children may imagine, do have a lot of magical thought. They may imagine that they're magically affecting things, which they might feel they were really not moving the tree, perhaps, you see. But the point is that we're aware of the difference between a movement which originates by itself and one which we have brought about, right? Immediately, without really having to think, this is what I'm aware of, right? I mean, that's the point. And we're suggesting that should be extended into thought, where that thought, we said, as it participates, it produces all sorts of things, but in addition, it produces it affects perception, so that what you think affects what you perceive outside and how you feel inside. Yes?
Well, I wonder again, is that example that you gave yesterday of the woman who had lost all proprioception and had to use her eyes to train herself, that even as we're sitting here, all of us are using that, we wouldn't be able to stay in the chair.
Yeah.
And in fact, she couldn't unless she watched herself, and otherwise she'd slither to the floor.
Yeah, well, that's a very good example, because suddenly she woke up without proprioception, and she couldn't move her body in any controllable or orderly way, and she couldn't sit up or anything, and she had to watch everything to see what was happening. And she managed somehow to learn to get along that way, but now it's very hard to explain. But you see, as you're sitting in this chair, you're aware of your body. You may not notice it, but there's an awareness of your body touching the chair, and the various little movements you've got to make to correct for the fact you're starting to fall and so on. And this is all part of proprioception, you see. You're not really thinking about it or having making decisions about it or anything like that, or the choices, but rather it's just working, right? Now, we're hoping that it could work in thought, that you would become aware that your thought is affecting your perceptions. Because the way it is now, the thought affects your perceptions. You see something produced by thought, and then the next thought comes along and says, well, that's the way it is. You see, and the thought is only telling you the way it is. Well, it's actually affecting the way it is, right? So and that mistake, you see, is crucial. It's the same as not having proprioception in the body. Right?
I used to make the mistake that proprioception of thought was linear, and that I had to follow my train of thought. And then I realized, which is sort of a contradiction, and so I realized that that it had to be sensation.
Yeah.
That I had to be aware of my thought through my sensation.
Yeah, the thought gives rise to sensation, or even the impulse to think is a sensation, and then your thought gives rise to further sensations and images and so on. And
okay, so if now while I'm talking to you, I become so fascinated with my talking that I lose the experience of the body, of sensation, then that would be thought, which is functioning without what you're calling proprioception.
Yes, that's right.
Whereas, if I come back into my body, okay, and I'm talking to you now, but there's some sense of these hands moving, the feel of this chair, the quality of the voice,
Yeah.
then it's a different process.
Yes,
Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. And all the different sensations which come from what you're saying are connected with what you're saying, right?
You cost me a lot of sleep last night.
I mean, the point is, we can always get better at proprioception. I say any person who is skilled, like an athlete or a dancer, must have a very good proprioception of exactly how they're moving, right? And they don't stop to think. They may have an intention in their thought as to where they want to get and so on, but actually doing it, they don't stop to knowing exactly how it's going, right? And compared with how it's related to how they intended. You see?
So are we saying, in effect, that we're speaking of a unified field of awareness which includes thought, but doesn't include or exclude the physical versus...
That's right, yes. But thought is part of the physical. The next point
Right.
I made yesterday is thought is a more subtle form of the physical.
Exactly.
And perhaps we want to try to discuss that some more. And say that thought is a material process, you see, a part of a material process, right? It goes on in the brain, the nervous system, and really the body and everything. It's all one system. And this thought is a material process, and thought can be conveyed by more material process like radio waves, television, writing, talking. Sound goes out and conveys thought, right? and so on. So therefore, the thought is conveyed by nervous signals. People have followed that. There's a sort of a code of some sort. We don't know it too well. And and therefore, this thought is a material process, right? But you see this. We can say, is this an insight or a perception that this is true? You see that if you have an insight, a perception that this is true, then it will really affect you. You see, we want to say that an insight or a perception of truth may affect the material process. See, that which includes all the reflexes, right? That because it is a material process, it has reflexes that just go by themselves, right? Right. And that's so. The point is that we merely have an intellectual or inferential, would be better, knowledge of what's going on, and it doesn't touch this process.
Now,
Yeah.
let's say when what you're calling an insight takes place, in effect, a reorganization has taken place. And this isn't something I have or know about in my thinking,
No.
but simply that the functioning is now somewhat different.
Yeah, there's been a change in, let's suppose we just use synapses as a kind of representation. It's not exactly, there's much more to it than that. But you have all the nerves which connect through synapses, and they made a set of synapses that produce a certain reflex that doesn't make sense, right? And it just keeps going. And now, by means of this perception of truth or insight, that perception acts just as thought acts, it participates, so every perception acts and participates. And it acts directly in this system and somehow makes a change so that it becomes inoperative. Perhaps it starts to dissolve away, you see, a bit. And you mustn't dissolve all the synapse connections away, or else you wouldn't be able to do anything. You see, it has to be done intelligently. And you see, have you ever seen there's something which seemed very attractive to you, and suddenly you had a perception of what it really is, and you say it doesn't attract me anymore at all. I'm dead to it, right? You see that? Do you see what I mean? That perception. See, there was a chemical sense inside of something, desire, wanting it, and then suddenly it stops, right? You see that. The chemistry is affected, right? See, by that perception. Now, now this material we discussed yesterday that matter may be infinitely subtle and so on. It doesn't mean that science knows all about it or ever will, but it's not mechanical, and therefore matter could respond to this perception in ways which might be beyond what science could even trace, right? So and very deep and subtle, and there will be a change, right? That's the notion that this will affect the whole thing. It not only affects the inferential understanding, but it also affects this chemical level and everything, you see.
It sort of stands to reason that it would if we see it all as a unified process.
Yes, but we won't even see it. You see, when it works, it's too fast for you to know what's happened, right? You know, that flash.
For thought to know.
Yeah. Well, you see, later on you will put it in words. Now, you see, now this is crucial. An insight, you see, the question when an insight is put into words, what is it that puts it into words? Is it thought or is it the insight? You see, the insight itself will be an insight into the words which express it properly. Right. Right.
Right.
So it's almost, the words are coming out almost like from a loudspeaker, you know, right? Rather than by somebody trying to get them out, right? Do you see what I mean?
Can a physical body be in motion and at the same time be detached and not feel its boundaries?
Well, it might, yes. But as I wanted to return, yes, that could all happen. You don't have to feel definite boundaries, you see. But I wanted to say about the insight that I think somebody else also had a question maybe before I go on.
I had a remarkable thing happen to me in the second half of the evening, about 5 o'clock, I guess, yesterday, and which was that I suddenly saw better, I heard better, I comprehended better, and the room was lighter, warmer. It was just a remarkable change of awareness. Is that related to?
Well, it could be. It's hard to tell. I mean, you see, it wouldn't help us to speculate too much. You see, it could be related to all this, some little change in the synapses, maybe.
I'm wondering.
You know,
It stirred up endorphins.
because the synapses shift around a bit, and maybe some of the blocks are gone. You know, you can't tell. Yeah.
What is gesticulation in context what we are discussing?
What?
Gesticulation.
Well, that's part of the expression, right?
That's it.
You see, you don't. It's not the result of thought. See, whatever is going on expresses itself through words, through gestures, in various ways. So it's just, and therefore the expression, whether verbal or not, is part of the perception, right? Or the insight. It's the action of the insight, and the expression is important because, see, the perception will not only change some of the, possibly call it the synapses or whatever they are, but it will also convey to thought the essential content of the insight, right? See, so thought can then proceed on a different basis, right, in a new direction. You see, therefore it's important that it go into words, right? But then those words have to come from the inside. You see, on the other hand, if words come by just from memory, then they may not be expressing it. You know.
Dr. Bohm, are you saying that when you have an insight, there's a creative process that happens that's in a language that's not, I use the word language as a poor word, it's in a mode that's not language, and that's a creative act. And there's something that the brain does, which again is another creative act, to transform that into a language that is words that we can communicate.
Yeah, but I think that it's all one act. You see, that the act the creative act simultaneously alters some of the reflexes and also produces the expression, which in words or in some other way, which will enable thought to take it up and move in a different way from there on.
I wonder if a simple analogy in this is the difference between the memory of a bunch of multiplication tables and understanding a formula. That once there's this understanding of the relationship, I'm not proposing this as an insight, then the overhead of remembering all of this other data is no longer, it's gone, and you can now relate to it without, again, this...
Yeah, well, yes, when you understand something in some way, it touches at a deeper level, you see, and then it will come out in words again.
So it's relevant, but not necessarily with as much overhead.
Yeah. So the point then is that we have the possibility of insight, and I'm saying, but these insights go on. Suppose we say, do we have as an insight that thought is a material process, you see? Or that thought always participates in perception, right? You see, is that if we have that insight, then that may remove some of the barriers to working that way. You see, our whole set of reflexes is against that. Right? So it says thought is not a material process. Our first reflex is thought is far beyond matter or separated from matter somehow. Right? It has some spiritual truth significance. Now, it doesn't mean, we're saying thought is a material process. Therefore, now, that means that, or thought participates, that means that the notion that thought is only telling you what things are is not really a serious option, you see. But that notion has been sort of conditioned into us as a reflex. Now, you see, if that comes as an insight, then it's going to begin to touch the synapses that hold that, and also the words will then produce a change in thought, right? You see, so the thought will begin to stop getting in the way of seeing these things, you see. Or if you say thought requires proprioception, or thought is not proprioceptive but requires proprioception, you see, as an insight. Now, there are various barriers probably to proprioception in our whole conditioning, because thought says it isn't necessary implicitly. So if thought is only telling you the way things are, proprioception is not necessary. Is that clear? There's nothing to perceive. You see, so therefore the notion that thought is only telling you the way things are is not a serious option. You see, it's not a serious thing to consider. When you have the insight, you no longer are taking seriously those things which previously loomed very all-important. You see, I mean, they're dead to them, right? Whereas previously they moved you very much and had tremendous meaning. Now you say they have no meaning. They're just mechanical stuff there.
I had a question relative to degrees of this. Apparently with proprioception that there are degrees of it. And does this relate to both in awareness as well as not in awareness or mindfulness? And are there people, such as Krishnamurti, who have a level of, or appear to have a higher level of proprioception or mindfulness of what is taking place?
Well,
Is what I'm saying?
Well, that may all be, you see, but we are liable to get into the domain of speculations that are carried into the system, you see. In other words, we would put this into our system of thoughts and reflexes, and it would become a kind of knowledge that would get in the way. You see, I'm trying to say that the important point is to actually see for yourself this proprioception, right? Or to see it in action, right? You see what I'm driving at? That there's a danger of this kind of imaginative speculation. You see, I wanted to discuss that for the imagination for a little while, so we could understand the role of imagination here. Right?
Well, is proprioception more active, let's say, as you're sitting here, aware of the pressure on your butt while you're sitting on a chair, or the trees moving outside?
Yeah,
we could concentrate and not be aware of that.
Yeah.
So is proprioception involved in all of that process?
That's right. It's there even when you're not aware of it very much, because your body would fall if it weren't, you see. But you can get to be more aware of it, right?
That's what I...
Yeah. Now, but I did want to say something about the imagination, you see, because it is very closely related to this question. Now, you see, the imagination means making an image and so on, and to see the image of something that is not there, right? In other words, fancy, and so on. But you see, there's no fundamental distinction in the process of imagination and perception. We've said that actually the entire consciousness is created by a process out of being guided by information from the senses. It's all created by a process which gives rise to our perception, and which that process is really a kind of imagination, right? Right. Now, you could call that primary imagination. Now then we can start to imagine things that are not there, that are not indicated by perception, and that may be creative. You see, we can imagine things the form of things which are unknown and which can be brought to realization. And then we have another kind of imagination which comes from the past, you see, from the reflexes. A reflexive imagination which could be called fancy or fantasy, which again could be useful because we can imagine things and imagine ourselves going in certain ways or doing certain things and solving problems that way. Or it can be dangerous because this fantasy slips over apparently into perception, right? In the way we described about thought. That you see, people can, when you're lost in fantasy, you see you are really almost perceiving the thing. You're not only perceiving what you fantasize, you are apparently experiencing and perceiving the self that is doing it, right? In other words, it's all built, you see. You can be an entirely different person in fantasy from what you would be outside. Right? I like The Secret Life of Walter Mitty and so on. And therefore, in fantasy, you could create yourself and create a world. And in fact, but then fantasy may start to merge with your perception of reality, right? So, you see, some people have suggested that, say, the infant, when he first starts to work, that's all fantasy, but it has to distinguish certain fantasies which are to be called reality, you see, right? Namely, those which stand up, everybody sees, which resist being pushed and so on, right? And which are not affected by how you think about them, and so on, the test for reality, you see. But the reality you perceive is affected by your thought and by that thought is working as a kind of imagination being infused into your perception. Right? Is that clear? And that imagination is then is necessary. It becomes part of what you see, right? And then it can also, if it gets held too strongly and resists evidence of incoherence, then it leads to all the problems we're talking about. Right? You see, so that's the general picture. That now you can see, therefore, that you have to watch carefully with the imagination, that it can be creative and it can be very destructive, right? Because the fantasy realm can merge with reality and also create a resistance to seeing that it is fantasy. It'll create reflexes that resist seeing it because you create such beautiful fantasies that you don't want to give them up, you see. I mean, they feel very good, the endorphins are produced and everything else. And therefore there is a movement, a reflex to hold them, right? And to resist thoughts that would say that they are not right. They're not the way it is. So, you see, therefore you get illusion and all that. And but I think that this notion of fantasy will help you understand better how thought can enter into perception. Now, but that, even when you don't think you're fantasizing, it's still entering perception, you see, because perception is all basically of the same nature as the process of imagination, but it is and that follows inevitably if you think of the fact that it is created from the brain in response to information. We can easily produce perceptions that are not right, and we have to correct them and so on.
Does the resistance to incoherence that includes chemical addiction, such as the alcoholic or the drug addict, present as great a problem as we presently see it?
Well, it's there because, you see, there a very strong chemical addiction occurs.
So now you've got two things to work with. You've got to detox. Well, there's the chemical addiction that must be worked out, correct?
Yeah.
Plus what we're talking about.
Yeah. But I'm saying the psychological addiction is always the most difficult one, you see, because, for example, the animals they experimented with, they injected them with some drug, maybe morphine, and made them chemically addicted. Now, and then if there were two groups. One was enabled to inject itself, and the other was injected. Right? Now, the group that was injected went through a withdrawal process, but then it was no longer addicted. But the group that was able to press the button, it got through the withdrawal process, but whenever they saw the button, they pressed it again. You see, the point is the memory of that pleasure produced a reflex to press the button, right? Or the button stirred up the whole system of memory, right?
Excuse me.
Where?
I'm not clear on perception is mostly, fantasy is mostly based on past experiences, and imagination is looking into something ahead, but that's also based on memory.
Yeah, well, there are several kinds of imagination. You see, I said that there is the imagination based on memory, which is either remembering the past or projecting the future. Now, in addition, there is a creative imagination which can project something that was never there, which you can bring into existence, like a new idea, right? To create something which was never there. In fact, everything which many things we see were the result of that here, right? And then I say perception is a similar process as imagination. This is the key thing. But we have no control over it or anything, it just happens, right? You see, but it's going on to create the whole impression of a world, which includes not only what we sense and what we perceive immediately, but also the effect of the past, that thought is affecting it, and so on, right?
So in fantasy there's never creativity?
There may be, but you see, in general, no, because it's based on the past, you see. I think there's a real distinction between creative imagination and fantasy. Though fantasy may look very creative and feel very creative, but it may not be, right? You see, that is, you can fantasize that you are being very creative, you see, or anything can be fantasized, right? The power of fantasy is beyond limit, right? So, therefore, and it has its place because, for example, if you imagine arranging things in the room in a different way, that's fantasy, right? But that may be useful.
I have a couple of questions. Is the perception of images and words, is that in itself a physical, sensory type of perception? Because that leads to emotions and sensations.
Yeah, it's part of the physical process, yes. You see, it's very similar to the process which actually occurs when you see and hear, but it's coming partly from memory, right?
So it's an actual physical thing in the brain and the body that it kind of all comes together?
Yeah.
And also, I see how, part of the problem is that we have these repressed words and images that are very quick, and, we're used to them, so we don't see that there's words and images there. So we need to become aware of that word and image when we think it's, pure perception. We have to become aware that the word and image is coloring that perception. But the other question is how these words and images create the pleasure. And then
suppose you go into the question of fantasy. When you're in a fantasy, you can create a great deal of pleasure, pain, fear. Think of that.
Create the pleasure, but I'm wondering what is the insight that can break that addiction?
Yes.
You see what I mean?
Yes. Well, let's look at it first for a while. You see that. In fantasy, you can create pleasure, pain, fear, anything here. Because it happens that from memory you are producing the same sort of experience that might be produced if it weren't memory, right? But they're similar, not the same. You always can tell that there's a difference if you're sensitive, right? But the fantasy may go so far as to captivate you, and so that you're not sensitive to the difference, right? And in fact, you may not want to be. Right? Yeah, so because it creates a reflex saying, this is so nice, I don't want to know anymore, I don't want to know about it. You see, I don't want to know evidence that it may not be so, right? Which everybody is familiar with that experience. Huh? So, now you can see it's basically coming from thought, isn't it? Memory, thought. By words you can create fantasies. You see, that's what advertising is doing all the time. A combination of words and images create fantasy, right? The purpose of the thing is to create the expectation or the sense of the pleasure you will get or the advantages you will get out of this product. Right? So it's aimed to get you to fantasize something about that product. And you see, they think it out very carefully. You see, a great deal of work is required to produce these things. And they think it out carefully, and the images have to be carefully chosen and connected with the words, right? So the point is, now you can see all around that how this process is going on. The advertisers didn't invent it, they're only taking advantage of something that's been going on for ages. So now you say, what about an insight, matter of perception? Well, we can't make that to order, but you see, what would you say? You see, can we have an insight that fantasy can, and thought and fantasy can produce that sense of reality?
Well, I mean, I feel that I have that insight, but I'm just saying, because of the pleasure that you get from it, because there's that connection in the brain or whatever, that mechanism, that these fantasies create pleasure or create pain. Saying, how can you, it seems like you need to somehow break that connection.
Yes, well, you need a further insight into why the mind is escaping the consequences of the first one, right? You see, so you could say that although we have this insight at the level of inference, right, these reflexes are still working. Right. So one thing to do is just get more familiar with it by watching this, by using the words which produce the pleasure as you would to produce the anger or the fear, and follow it through. You see, now I think if you stay with that and build up that pleasure from those words, you will eventually get the sense that it's mechanical, that it's just something going on in the body, right? It hasn't a great significance.
I see it slightly differently, maybe. Let's say the reflex continues, but I've had this insight of, when I use that word, somehow, as the reflex comes up, that synapse is there. It doesn't have the hold. It's like, so it's going to do its thing, but it doesn't, I don't believe in it in the same way.
That weakens it, you see.
It weakens it.
Yeah, but you can, if you wish, sort of do this exercise of really making the reflex work. You see, now that it's been weaker, until it had been weakened, you couldn't do this.
Yeah.
You see, as long as you believed in that, the idea of doing this would have been impossible. But, you see, I don't believe in it anymore, and therefore I can try to make the reflex work and become very much more clear that it is a reflex.
And if you do what you're suggesting, would you speed up the process of getting rid of the synapse? Would that speed that process up?
It might, yes. You see, it might do something, and then at some stage you would have an insight that the whole thing has no meaning. It's sort of just simply a mechanical process.
Well, that's,
But at that point, that insight isn't something that's happening about the words anymore, but rather some direct perception of the crossover between fantasizing and perceiving in the process of that happening.
Well, you get a direct sense of that, and that begins to remove those reflexes which were telling you it's the other way around. You see, the thing that's confusing us is that we still have a lot of reflexes telling us it's not that way at all, right?
But you may develop, I don't know if it's a stronger reflex. I don't know whether that's a problem, but the reflex of questioning all the reflexes.
Yeah, well, you have to question these reflexes because you had an insight, you see, namely that there's a vast number of reflexes and there's no reason why they should be intelligent, right? You see, that's the insight. That.
If you think of this as a button, rather than an insight into the fact that there's this, bubble of buttons that we're moving around with, that the insight needs to be as the button needs to be. When the button is being pushed, can there be an insight in the act of its action during its happening, not thinking about it?
Yeah, or even before, because you have seen through this so thoroughly that you have no wish to press the button. You see.
The real proof of the insight, if you're going to call it that, is the thing just doesn't happen.
Yeah. But you see, we have to test the insight, because we can always fantasize that we've had it, you see, and therefore we can test the insight by seeing, does it stand up reasonably and logically, are we actually able to do it, and so on. You see, you have to watch it all the time, right? You see, because It's very easy to have a fantasy of an insight and say, I've had an insight.
We want to be a little bit more careful when we're using the word insight. I think we started using the word insight in a little bit, not being very careful about this. I'm not making the insight happens. And we are starting a little bit using the insight as that I had an insight, that I had an insight, that I made an insight. And I think we have to be a little more careful when we are using the insight, or using the word of insight, and start being more sensitive what insight is.
Yeah, or else to be sensitive to something that can be mistaken for insight.
Yes.
You
It
see,
can easily deceive, thought can deceive itself that I had an insight, and it can even fabricate that it had an insight, but that's nothing to do with it.
That's the reflexive imagination. You see that the point is that when you see something new, you could even say the insight is almost a kind of creative imagination, but which actually acts directly in the material process. But you can also get imagination which comes from the memory, and which doesn't really, it's a reflex that is not really relevant to this very subtle. You see, you could say that if you imagine the infinitely complex nervous structures, synapses and so on, the memory could never handle that. You see, never know all that. Could never know all that, but the insight is able to meet that as it actually is at the moment. This is the crucial thing, without time. If it takes time, it won't meet it.
But in a way, I think you could almost say that no one could ever have an insight. That within a particular organism, something might occur, and after the fact, someone might say that was called an insight.
Yeah.
But whether you imagined it or if something actually happened, it would never be anything you had. There might be a different organization within the organism.
Yeah, the insight took place, and there was a change in the organism. See, the insight is not only probably from immense depths of subtlety, perhaps even beyond the organism, for all we know, but it works, the important point is, wherever it comes from, it works directly at the physical, chemical level of the organism, along with everything else. See, so it really affects you through and through.
Is insight somewhere available to all of us, and it takes an emotion of something opening and something coming in?
Well, we don't know where it comes from, but I'm suggesting it is available to all of us, but the reflex of thought is continually resisting and defending against it. Because the insight may be seen as a threat to the structure which you want to hold.
But it is inside the threat for the conditioning. When insight happens, I don't think conditioning is affected.
Yeah,
and maybe even not a lot of that not surviving. A lot of the conditioning dies, is dissolved.
It is a threat to the conditioning, but the conditioning is, you see, in fact, is not all that important, but the conditioning contains a reflex that informs you that it's very important, you see. Right? You see that this, you see that now, I wonder if we shouldn't go into the question of the self-image. You see, we've already sort of touched on it by thinking of the imagination in fantasy giving a sense of a self that could be very different from your usual sense, right? And you really feel it, you experience it, right? Or you can be watching a television or a play or a movie and getting lost in the characters, and you can feel that that character really is you. You see, you're experiencing the character through yourself, right? Because, you see, the television is nothing but a lot of light, dots of light. And you know, all the things you see in there are really yourself, right? And that's how you see everything, right? And you can see there that a kind of imagination is involved in looking at the television image, right? say, if you were to look carefully, it's nothing but flashing lights there. But you see people, you see trees, you see characters, you see emotional conflicts, you see danger, you see anger and fear, pleasure. You see, but it's all yourself, right? You see, it's all the imagination being infused into there, right? And just as it gets infused into perception. You see, so you conceive when you're looking at the television set that it must come from something like the imagination. You see, so where else could it come from? You see that. So the point then is it becomes more and more clear how thought enters into perception. But it doesn't know it's doing it. In fact, most of the time you don't need to know, but when there's incoherence, you may need to know, right? This is the point. And if there's a resistance to knowing it when you need to know, then there's the trouble. If there are reflexes that resist knowing. You see, but you can't keep track of all that. Every time you watch the television set, you think, well, this is really me projecting into the television screen. It's like the rainbow. I see a rainbow out there, there's actually drops of rain falling, and light refracting off and so on, according to physics. And I can say, well, over there, the same sort of thing happens when you're looking at the television. There are spots of light, and you see all sorts of things happening, right? It's the same nature as the rainbow, right? There is a process going on. That's the closer to the actuality, isn't it? A complex process in the television set with the light, with your nerves, with everything. You can't get hold of it all. But we see, that is a kind of, that is a representation, isn't it? See, that drama is representing something in many, many levels. And that representation is what you see, right? An experience. You see, so I'm just trying to make it more clear how this thing is really a very common experience, and not so hard. That really we are infusing our imagination, our past, our knowledge into what we see. Not we are doing it, but it's doing itself. So and that doesn't necessarily bad or anything like that. That may be very necessary in many, many contexts. But when we fail to see this as happening, then we are in danger, right? Especially if there's resistance to seeing that it is happening. We are conditioned to resist seeing this as happening. See, so, and that's really where the self-deception arises. So now, it's around the self-image that the problem is most difficult, or anything like that. You see, we've got a kind of self-image. Now, it's almost like a television program going on inside. It's going on in the nerves. And the image really has two parts, several parts, you see. One seems to be somebody inside that you're looking at, and the other seems to be somebody who's looking. Right? That is, there are several words. See, the word me, the word I stands for the subject, right? The one who sees, who acts, who does, who determines everything, who has will. See, will is the same as determinate intention. Determined means that strong will, and therefore it's the one who I will, I determine, I see, I choose, I think. I am the active agent, right? And then there's me, to whom it's all done, right? The object. Is that clear? Me is the object. They say, me, everything happens to me, right? But of course, we now say that the basic concept, the self, is what unites those two. You see, I and me are two sides of myself, right? So there's me, myself, and I, right? So that's a concept of the self, right? You see, we've discussed this many times, that the word I by itself means almost the same as God, you see. It's the ultimate source of everything, right? like in the ancient, the story of Moses who came to the burning bush and the desert, and he asked the voice what was its name. Well, his name was I Am That I Am. See, I Am was the first name, and I Am was his second name. He later said that I Am was his name, because he said, "Who shall I say send me?" And he said, "You shall say that, quote, I Am sent you." You see, so evidently I Am was considered to be the name of God, right? Which was very sacred and not supposed to be repeated and so on. But but see, that's a kind of perception that the word I Am by itself represents the pure subject, the pure source, the source of everything, right? And whereas me represents the object, and we then equate I am with me, saying I am this, I am that, I am what am I? I am all the things that you attribute to me, right? Right? So there comes the problem of equating I am with me, and me is always limited, right? Little me, as they say. Who are you to think you are the great I am? They say so. Me is always limited, but then you say me is the same as I am, right? As I. So that creates a conflict. You see, people want to say I'm the greatest, I'm the best, I'm the most wonderful. We have this great, bright, and shining image, and then the world comes along and says, you're nothing. You're just fooling yourself, and so on. It deflates that, and it becomes a shock, right? It creates a great pain. You see, the fantasy of pleasure can equally turn into fantasy of pain and fear and horror, right? In a fantasy, you can really get into all that. So the point is that this thought of I and me, it's very hard to make it to keep it orderly, or to make sense of it, to make it coherent. See, this contradiction between I am and me, people don't know how to resolve. That people say you should not treat me as an object. I don't like it. I mean, I'm insulted and hurt, right? Yet, me, by definition, is an object, right? You say, who do you think you are that you should be different from everybody else and not treated as an object, right? You think you shouldn't be limited, and so on. You see, the little child may feel that there's no limit. He is everything. It forms that thought, and that reflex, and it forms that fantasy. And whether it reflects anything real or not, we don't know. But the important point is it gets set up as a reflex, right? Saying, that's me, right? See, but on the other hand, the great bright and shining being he sees from within is not always seen from without, right? He also depends on other people to tell him what he is and who he is, right? He would hardly form an identity without that. And other people don't back that up. They may, when he's a very young child, treat him as God, but then suddenly appears a time when they don't, right? So, therefore you have this tremendous conflict. You see, you have what Freud called the narcissistic image, right? The narcissism. That the legend, the Greek legend of Narcissus, you see, he saw a beautiful man who saw his image in the water and didn't realize it was an image. He fell in love with it, but he could never get to this image, and he pined away and died, right? Now, the point was that, see, the irony was that he already had what he was longing for, right? He already was what he was longing for.
If you didn't trust it.
Well, he didn't believe it, you see. I mean, he wouldn't accept it. You see, he said, that's somebody else, right? Who I need, right? You see, but then the point is but when we produce that image in fantasy, that becomes the thing longed for, right? And we say, there it is, far away from me, or far away from, I've got to reach it. See, but that's another fantasy, another image, right? So that creates the sense I need to have that, right? The sense of necessity gives the greatest force and power there is in human affairs, right? So, therefore, the point is then that you can't resolve that. You see, the child never really learns in our current society, or any society we know of probably, to see that this, to get free of this image, you see, to get free of being bound to that image, and right? So when this image is punctured or hurt, or you see, it hurts, right? The fantasy of this great, glorious, shining being is then turned into a fantasy of somebody who is despised and looked down on and limited and, nothing much, and and so on, which creates pain, and so on. So it then creates, I need other people to tell me how great I am, or I need to get proof of how great I am, right? By what I do, or what I own, right? And so on, right? You see, that's very powerful. Human affairs are very powerfully dominated by all that. Right? I mean, a megalomania would say, I must govern the world in order to show what I am. You see, like Alexander the Great, who was reputed, I think his father, he never got along with his father, nor did his mother, and he was identified with his mother, and somehow they got to hate his father, and he probably was behind it all, the notion he would show his father how great he was. He conquered the world, you see, to do that. And then when he had done it, he said he's very sad because he has no more worlds to conquer, you see. In other words, he has to keep on conquering the world. He never can stop, you see, because he'll never, he has to feed that image all the time, right?
But the philosopher, the organist beat him down. When Alexander the Great went to visit the philosopher, he was just living in the nature, so enjoying the sunshine, and Alexander the Great made a shade as he stood in front of him. So the philosopher just told him, you get please away, because you can't prevent something you can't give me, the sunshine. Right. So he beat his image down, the wisdom of the philosopher, the organist.
Yes, well, I think, I suppose Alexander was probably always suspecting that it wasn't really quite true. I mean, he wasn't stupid. I mean, he was really very intelligent, but he was caught in this image, and he had tremendous power because of it, because people would do anything for him because he had such power, and so you can see how this whole thing. See, everybody has the same image which has been beaten down. And if they see Alexander, the soldiers see Alexander the Great, the bright, shining, glorious image, and they identify with it, so they feel, I'm that way too, right? So they'll do anything for him. Whatever he says they'll do, so they became very powerful. You see, so you see the power of all this imagination and fantasy, and see, and all through the world, that sort of thing, there's Hitler and there's all sorts of people like that. Has produced effects like that, and so we haven't resolved this question. You see, the point is now that this self-image contains two parts. At first it seems reasonable, you see, because by comparison with the body, I can look at my body, myself, in two ways physically. You see, I say, here is my body, I'm looking at it, but I who am also looking, right? So it seems that I am looking at myself, right? The reflexive act. It makes sense, right? I wash myself, I shave myself, I do all sorts of things like that. And there's I who is looking and I to whom it is done. I who is the subject and I who am the object, right? And therefore, and then when we form the image inside, it seems then there is I who is the subject who is looking at me, who is the object, right? Down here somewhere perhaps is the object and up here is somebody looking, right? That can be arranged by fantasy, I see, quite easily. And you see, once thought says that's the way it is, then remember, thought enters perception, so you perceive it that way. But now, that thing which you perceive, which is perceived in that way, if it were there, it would be extremely important and precious, wouldn't it? It would be it would be this great, glorious, shining God, or at least it ought to be. It would be the center of existence and everything, right? For the little child it is. And in fact, it never goes for anybody, you see. So Therefore, that which is inside there, when it's pleased and shining and bright, it has tremendous importance and necessity. It's not merely the chemistry, but the chemistry is given extremely high value by the importance and necessity attached to the meaning. Right? Is that clear? They go together. Because there's tremendous chemical effects going on, neurophysiological effects of such a great shining image, which is perceived as reality, and also tremendous meaning which holds it. So, therefore, when it doesn't work, it really disorganizes the system and so on. And therefore, the self-image becomes central, and everything becomes arranged to sustain that self-image in as good a way as possible. We try to arrange thoughts that way. We try to get people to support it. We try to produce a situation. See, people will make a lot of money to show that they are really very great people, right? They make far more money than they need for whatever they want to do. They keep on making money, and the mere making of money is enough to show that they're great people. And otherwise, they can buy all sorts of things, far more than they need to show it, and so on. You see, so why do people do this? It's accepted, it's taken for granted that they will do it, right? But you see, we have to look into it. Why? And you can see that there is a process going on here which involves the whole system. And people will reinforce each other in this, because people get their identity from each other, right? Everybody says, you are this, you are this, you are this, or else I get my identity by what I do, or by thinking of where I came from, or what my ancestors were, and all that. So you get a sense of identity built up out of thought, right? Saying that's terribly important. You have to prove that you're there, right? See, since this structure actually has no base whatsoever except thought, which is a very flimsy base. Therefore, and since it's all important, apparently, it would be very important to prove that it is solidly grounded. Otherwise, it will be rather alarming to see this all-important structure with no ground.
I feel that I ask myself, who am I? And I realized that I was several images. I was one image to my 5 children. Each one of them had a different image of me. My husband, my friends, whatever thought about it. And then going through where, hey, I'm not those images, I'm something else. But then even that something else was in question. And it was a constant change. What I thought I was yesterday, tomorrow I'm finding, hey, I'm not what I thought I was. And then I put that question to my body, and I said, if I had 1 arm less than I have now, would I be less of who I think I am? And I went all along disappearing myself in pieces, and so I said, I'm not my body, but there was something else left, but I couldn't explain what it was.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. How are we going to find what we are, you see? You can try to identify, you can't exist without your body, but people don't usually take that all that seriously. Their identity as what they can do or what they have or what their relations are is usually taken as more important, and the people will allow their bodies to degenerate in favor of that and so on, you see. So the other people may regard their bodies as all important. You see, it can vary. You can put your identity into almost anything, into your country or into your bank account or into your achievements or into your, anything. So the whole thing doesn't seem to have any ground. You see, now, if this self were what it was apparently supposed to be, then it would be very important to get a real solid ground for it, and that's why we feel the urge to search for this identity. Now, and yet people never really are not really that sure about their identity. You see, now, the question is, do we need an identity? Other than identity cards, which tell you, you do need to know in some sense who you are, in some limited sense, clearly, that you have certain memories and needs and certain relationships, so on, you keep that all straight. But is that the supreme important thing that it seems to be? Or does it?
Would
would be interesting if we have an identity with our own, with the system you were talking about.
Yeah, the system gives you the identity. You see, without the system, you would have no identity. You see, the whole system of thought spread over the world is what gives you your identity, your place in the world, and so on. If there were no system, how could you sustain that identity? You see, so the identity could only exist socially and culturally, you see. Although we may try to imagine we identify ourselves with God or something like that, but that again, it's the culture which gave you the thought that allows you to do that. So that's what we have to keep in mind, and that perhaps, see, there was an ancient view I read about long ago, which was that I don't know what I am. What I am is unknown, but constantly revealing itself. I see, this is another view of what you are. You see, now let's look at that view for a moment. You see, I am unknown. My ground is, if there is if there is a universe or something beyond the universe, or whatever is, which is infinite, I'm grounded somehow in that, maybe. The whole physical being. See, even matter is infinite, probably in its subtlety, and there may be something beyond. And therefore, that must be whatever I am. That must be the source of it. Right? That's unknown, but it reveals itself. You see, now we don't need the notion of an identity, of all-important identity to which we're going to hold, because that gets in the way of the need to change your reflexes. You see, once you identify with something, your reflexes are that way. It's very important, necessary, and you will want to preserve that identity, even though it may involve ideas that are false.
Really, what you're saying is it's very important for us to preserve the particular kind of chemistry that we're used to.
Well, that's what it amounts to. You see, implicitly, that that identity will give us a certain chemistry, and we also feel we want to preserve that the whole body gets used to that. So the body itself can get used to a certain chemistry, and it demands that chemistry be preserved. And in addition, so thought will try to do that, but in addition, thought has put it that there is an identity which has to be, more abstractly, that has to be preserved, you see, which is absolutely necessary.
Okay, so just so I can say it in my own words, the identity lies in abstraction, which are images.
Yeah.
Each one of those images is a continuum, has a chemistry, and so that chemistry, in some sense, has a reality to it, and so that chemistry is...
Well, the chemistry and the physics and...
all movement.
Yeah, it's all movement. It goes beyond chemistry. It includes chemistry and possibly some material reality beyond chemistry, say, the physics, the electricity, and beyond that.
So then, I find this out from someplace, and I, in my abstractions, would like to change, but I don't have any notion that it's not the images that have to change, it's the chemistry that has to change.
Yeah. Well, it's all the whole thing has to change, you see, but we may change the images, but the chemistry doesn't change right that way. But the whole thing has to change. We need an insight into the whole.
Could the fixedness of the chemistry be the cause of disease?
Yes, the fixedness of the chemistry and the fixedness of the ideas around it are inseparable, you see, because if your ideas about the chemistry say that that's absolutely necessary to maintain it, then that helps fix the chemistry. So you can't say that the chemistry is fixed independently of the ideas about the chemistry that the chemistry is carrying.
Is there a need for labeling things, people, and put them in little boxes? Part of this holding on to image, like I'm shy, or I'm an extrovert, or we always give little labels to different feeling situations and people. I'm a lawyer, and that becomes the total of who I am.
Well, that's part of the image, yes. You see that we put people, as you say, into boxes, and then they don't quite fit, so they may have several different boxes. You see that somebody, as they say, you wear several different hats, and when you're at work you have one hat, when you're at home you have another one, and so on. So the whole process is not coherent, you see. When you begin to look at it, you see it doesn't hold together, and therefore we've seen this incoherence of the image, and if you really see it, then we have to say that making the image all important is not really a serious option anymore. You see that if you really don't believe it anymore, you see that it may be that it's still going to work. It still has, we say, a large amount of chemistry that we haven't got at, and so on. But you see that it's a very crucial bottleneck or crucial step right here is to see that this whole process, the insight that this whole process really has no meaning, it has no ground. It's really the most ephemeral sort of thing. The thoughts, there's nothing more ephemeral than thoughts, right? And yet thoughts can hold themselves by saying, I must remain that way forever with absolute necessity, and so on. And so on. So the point is then that you have the notion of a creative being rather than an identified being, right?
As ephemeral as thought may be, thought is thought not in fact in the cells, the brain cells?
It's in the brain cells, but as an ephemeral movement, right?
Coming and going?
It comes and goes, it mixes up with the chemistry and the electrical currents and all that.
Which may block the creative energy. If this identity movement can be strong, it can be a block for us.
Oh yeah, it certainly blocks it. You see, the identity movement may be the major block. You see, we've been following the blocks all along, and now this may be very close to the major block, the source, the attempt to hold this identity may be, which is part of the reflex system.
I don't think so far it took so seriously the danger of the identification. It's this moment, as you are making it clear, it is really there is a danger in this in this functioning or to have an identity, in this ephemeral movement of identity, which can block the energy and it can be a strong addiction because it becomes closer to the power of necessity.
Yes, well, it all ties up, you see, and so I think we could think of that for a little while, look at it, that the identity has a certain limited significance. It's not that we are going to dispose of it, but that it has no fundamental, deep, eternal significance, and therefore there's eternal flow and movement, and that it's creative, you see. And that now, however, this creativity can get caught up in a certain process which appears to be mechanical, but it isn't really mechanical. It can always change with new insight. It's not, if it were a machine, it could never change, but it isn't actually fully, deeply a machine. But it can be, apparently, it can have something like a machine. We can represent it as mechanical up to a point, you see. And therefore, now that really, yes, well, perhaps we'll leave it at that for a while and we'll take our break. Right? Well, we've been discussing this self-image for a while. You know, the self as observer, the self as observed, they seem to be separate because they've been imaged that way, right? And the image produces the perception of that separation. And does anybody want to, perhaps we talk about it for a little while, if you want.
Would you just, it was very clear to you, I didn't quite seize the answer, that I was, the clarity.
Of what?
When the sentence that you said just before we broke about, was it the image of the self that included some of the unknown with it, or?
Well, no, well, yes, we said there was the notion that whatever we mean, clearly the human being actually is there in some sense. He is actual, right? The question is, you know, does the human being exist with a permanent identity, right? Or what would it be if there is one, right? And we said that this notion of identity doesn't seem to be very coherent, and the whole basis is very ephemeral and substantial in thought. And and then there was a suggestion of another kind of way of looking at the human being, which is that any person is really unknown what his ground is. See, it might be in the whole totality of whatever, all matter, beyond matter. You see, even if we think of ourselves, we are matter which has come together from all over the world, right? You see, the carbon in us has probably come from carbon dioxide, which has been diffusing over the whole atmosphere. So it may have been somewhere on the other side of the world. And it got into plants and into animals and so on, and got into us. And so on with the oxygen and all sorts of water and all sorts of other things. So, you see, our ground is materially is in the whole universe, really, isn't it? And you could then follow it through scientifically and say it came from the Earth, but the Earth was formed from hot gas, which came from stars or whatever, came from interplanetary dust, and on back to the Big Bang. So, and even beyond, and so we could say all of that has conspired to produce us, right? And the material structures that we are. And so we would have to say that in some sense this matter is actual. See, but our thoughts about it are not actual, right? They are representations. They contain forms. The thought about the table contains a form, but the table doesn't end any, at the atomic level would sort of shade out a bit. And if you take modern physics, one of the things they say is empty space is full of energy, a vast amount of energy, and each wave in empty space has a certain minimum energy even when it's empty. And if you add up all the waves, it would be infinite, but if you add up waves down to a certain length, called the Planck length, beyond which we might hope that expect the present laws of physics might not hold, it would be so-called 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, a very short distance. Now, if you added up all those waves, the total energy in a cubic centimeter would be more than the energy of all the matter in the universe, which, when disintegrated, gave rise to energy. You see, so the idea then is space is mostly full and matter is a small ripple on it. You can make a very strong case for that according to modern physics. Right? Now, similarly, we could say whatever is behind the mind, or whatever we want to call it, the consciousness, is a vast stream, and on the surface are ripples, which are thought. Right? So we could say there seems to be an analogy. So therefore, even when we talk of things being here and so on, they're really small ripples on some vast energy which is circulating. And the only reason that this energy doesn't show up because this matter and light go right through it without deflecting. Right? Is that clear? So what we experience as empty space may be the fullness. So it may be the ground of our existence is in the empty space, which is really full. And that matter is a sort of small variation of that. It's actual, and there's no question of its actuality. But now, we now begin to think of the forms in thought by which we try to represent matter. And those forms are much more abstract than matter, right? So we can elaborate those forms in all sorts of ways, make very realistic looking pictures and so on, but they are not the things, the material things. So matter, and then we say that form, however, may serve as a guide like a map and lead to coherent action and so on, right? If it's correct, if it's a correct representation. Otherwise it leads to incoherence and so on, and we have all that whole story. Now, so that's the general picture, that the things that we actually see are there in some sense because we are going to discover that in our relation with them, if there's correct thought, then we are going to be coherent, right? But the ground of the thing is really much deeper. See, at the very least, it's in the material structure, which is far more solid than the thought about it, right? And then beyond the material structure is another structure, which may be even infinitely more solid than that, right? Or far more substantial than that. See, so maybe mind is another side of that same thing. That which we call energy on one side is mind on the other side, that it's sort of pervaded with a kind of intelligence, right? Out of which perhaps insight comes. You see, that's the suggestion, or perception, the deeper perceptions of truth. So now, well, what about ourselves then? We'd say our ground is in all that, but we have all sorts of representations of ourselves which are really rather superficial. We try to identify with them. Right? And then once we do that, we have this quality of thought that it infuses it in. We apparently perceive the thing which we were representing, and it seems it's there. It's like the rainbow. We see a rainbow, but what we have is drops of rain and light. Now, a process. So what we see is a self, but we have is a whole lot of thoughts going on in consciousness, and against the backdrop of consciousness, we're projecting a self rather than a rainbow, right? If you walk toward the rainbow, it will never get there. Sometimes, if you walk toward the table image is produced in the same way, but you will get there and touch it. I'm suggesting if you try to touch the self, it will be the same difficulty as touching the rainbow. That is, we have a representation of the self which is really arising in a process. We don't know this process very well. And the attempt to treat it as an object or was just going to not mean anything. Right? So instead, suppose we say the self is an unknown. Its origin, its ground is unknown, and it's constantly revealing itself, right? Through each person, right? Or through nature, or through various other ways.
The self?
Whatever you mean by yourself. You see, the word self, according to the dictionary, its basic meaning is the quintessence, the essence of the essence. Say the fifth essence it was called. There were four essences in medieval time, in the ancient times, and then they added a fifth one, which was the essence of the whole thing. So the idea is the thing itself means the very essence of it. Right? So what you mean by the self is your very essence, right? Which you say I, me, and myself. Right? The essence from which I and me have their ground. Huh? Right? So that's a use of language which will give rise to representations which we are liable to mistake for actuality. Huh? You see, so that's all I'm saying. That whatever the self is, the essence is unknown, but constantly revealing itself.
I have a feeling that we're searching for the self, the instinct, the feeling, whatever, it's there, we don't know what it is. In the meantime, the brain has done, the thought has done a tremendous job of convincing us that we are the thought and we are the body, and if we go beyond that, there's death. Can we walk through that, through the ripple, into the main stream of the river? And is this a quest? And do we have to cross?
Yes, if the mind could go into the depth of it rather than staying on the ripples, you see, then perhaps it could be seen differently. But so let's try to proceed. The point. And now I'm really suggesting that one point is to clear up the thought. You see, we may think we are something limited and known, right? I'm saying we have this insight. We cannot be that which is limited and known. Nothing can be what is limited and known, right? Its actuality cannot be that. That can at best be an abstraction or a representation.
Is it helpful to look at this in terms of orientation difference? That the one sense that you're talking about is I am learned, all the memory, the sense of identification of self at that level is learned.
Just speak a little louder, please.
So at one level, we might say I am learned, and a different orientation might be I am learning.
Yes, so if you're learning, then you can't be knowing. You can't know if you're learning. You see, there must be what you're learning is what implies the unknown, right? Now, learning is constantly, we could say the unknown is therefore revealing itself in what you're learning. See, but there's always the unknown. In other words, we were not going to exhaust the unknown, because we've said even in physics this picture of almost infinite energy and empty space. So the suggestion is that there's a vast unknown. We are learning, if you like, it's revealing itself. And even if we're not learning, it's revealing itself. And that's the general notion. That's the creative view of being, right? Rather than the idea of an identity of being.
What is revealing itself?
The unknown ground of that which of all that is, right? Now it reveals itself in many ways. So, and that is a creative view, a creative notion of being, right? See, so that is what we're suggesting, rather than a notion of identity, which is limited and repetitive and so on. You see that we don't know. If you once say I am this forever, then it sort of blocks things. You see, you could always ask, how do you know that's what you are? You may have been that way, but there's no proof that whatever has been will always be, right?
If I hold up my hand, I could say this is the unknown revealing itself.
Yeah.
If I look at your cup, I can look at that as the unknown revealing itself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything, that it may reveal itself in a very similar way to what it was before. Many things just keep on revealing itself in a certain similar way, though underneath it's eternal flux, but producing similar forms, right? Which we are representing in our thought. Now, then our thought is adequate for representing those forms, and it sort of hints at what's beneath, but it really can't get hold of that. And
if I do something like if I make a painting, that's the unknown revealing itself to me also.
It can be, yes, or it could be from your memory or from, even the memory is basic. Its basic actuality is the unknown, right? Right? We have to say everything that we know is a form which we sort of project onto the background consciousness, because the same as the rainbow, right? It can be projected correctly or incorrectly. You see, it's not that every form is as good as every other, but many, many forms can be projected. You see, and we could have different cultures and different views of life and so on, which have different degrees of coherence. See, the whole point is that the overall view is in the culture, which may be, we have to ask how coherent is it, and we'll discuss that this afternoon in connection with dialogue. But see, this thing is done not only individually, but collectively even more so. See, that we are, by sharing our thought and consciousness, we are projecting forms into everything. Right?
Is that, when you say the culture is coherent or incoherent, what you're saying is the representation, the abstraction, will either be coherent or incoherent. But the substance itself, let's say the frame and the canvas of the painting, that is always coherent.
Yeah, the material structure is always coherent, though it may not be what we want it to be, right?
So incoherence can only lie in representation.
In the forms of representations and in the actions to which those forms lead, right?
Is there nothing that's limited and known except through wrong looking at it?
Well, thought always provides limits, you see, which have relative validity. Right. But the notion of that they're absolute validity, I think, you see, that's what I'm suggesting. You see, that you have two possibilities. One is to say that knowledge could get everything and it's all limited. Right? And the other is to say the other way around. Now, if knowledge is all limited, you see, people are trying to find out what is it. Scientists thought they had it in the 19th century, and then they said, no, it's not so. Now, there's no sign that we have the final theory yet, but people are talking about the theory of everything, which we hope to get. And you see, but you could say, first of all, there's no sign that any knowledge we've ever had has been limited. That doesn't prove anything, but it makes one question, right? And then you could say, suppose even that you had a theory, the physicists had finally found the theory of everything, the ultimate particle, final particles, which we will call the ultimons. And then it would just go on century after century. They would calculate in terms of the ultimons and everything would work out. But there'd still be no proof that maybe in the next minute or next hour or day or century they wouldn't discover a limit to all that. It wouldn't work. Right? In other words, there's no way to know that you've got it, right? So it's a poor strategy or tactic to assume it, because if you assume it, that you have the ultimate, then you won't look for anything else, and therefore it will tend to trap you. You have no way of knowing that you have the ultimate. You may say, God told me, and so on, but then people say, how do you know that, and so on. You see, you cannot ever get absolute assurance that you have ultimate knowledge, right? And no matter how convinced you are of it. See, the best you can say, as far as I can see, that's the way it is, right? Now,
So the search for the ultimate in terms of knowledge might be a mistake in itself.
Yeah, it may be a very serious mistake, part of the flaw that we're talking about in the system. See, we have to be open. You can see how important it is, because if ultimate knowledge were possible about the atom, it would imply it might be possible about our identity, right? Because we're made of atoms, right? You see, so therefore the people, many scientists are working on that assumption, saying that we will have it all, and that artificial intelligence will reproduce everything, and so on. See, but I'm saying I think that is an incoherent procedure.
How would you differentiate between the search for ultimate knowledge and the search for something ultimate beyond knowledge?
Well, yeah, but you can't search for it, you see, because the very word search implies, trying to get hold of it. You see that I think we have to say only, as far as thought is concerned, we leave open the possibility that something beyond knowledge is possible, and indeed very plausible, right? From all that we've said, that we've said that there's a great deal of evidence that now, first of all, knowledge cannot be complete, and secondly, there has to be something beyond, but we have no proof, right? Now then we have to say, is it possible to somehow come in contact with this in some other way? So that would say maybe it'd be possible, maybe not.
Is the moving force the same for the search for ultimate knowledge and the beyond?
Well, I wouldn't think so. You see, that is, I think the search for ultimate knowledge would have to be a search for security. Now, from beyond, we have to say it's the unknown, right? And now, whatever is, you see, that will not give the kind of sense of it may be, if you would really see that, it would give security, but at least the way we picture it is that it doesn't look very secure.
From this viewpoint.
Yeah. Maybe when you are that, then maybe it is secure, but...
So you're suggesting that knowledge isn't the barometer of knowing?
Well, we know that already, because knowledge is always subject to test for incoherence, right? Which must get beyond knowing. You cannot know all the tests for incoherence, right?
So some other sensitivity in knowing, other than knowing being knowledge-based,
yeah,
is...
Knowing is a process based on the unknown.
I'm wondering if we could look at the relationship between this self-image, the ultimate self-image, and the search for the ultimate knowing, with how that relates to what we were talking about before, the word creating the sensation and so on, how they all relate to each other.
Well, see, if you assume, as the culture often generally does, that there is an ultimate knowledge, then that will be perceived as something which is there as a possibility, right? And you see, therefore, your intentions, your impulse, your motivation will be toward it. Because if there is such ultimate knowledge, it would be the right thing to try to get it. Now, if there isn't, then you will say, that's dead to me, I have no interest in that.
You view universal truths, or I don't know what to call them really, ideas, I suppose, that seem to run across all countries and cultures, such as maybe take the Ten Commandments or the Golden Rule or something like that. I mean, is that like a reflection, or is that just a self-image that's projected by all people on the planet?
Well, there may have been insight, that there's an insight, that you have to, be related in a certain way, right? For society to work, right? Or for anything to have any meaning. I mean that you can't treat people totally immorally and so on. It'll all come back to you, for example. You see that it's incoherent.
Was that something outside then of a projected self-image?
No, I think the original insight was beyond that, but then thought takes hold of it and turns it into the system and projects the self-image, you see. In other words, everything can be turned into this mill, you see.
Can we stay open-ended and without having expectations of acquiring knowledge, results, and let things flow and just let it be?
Well, that's the question we're raising. You see, that the only answer would be whether do we do it or don't we? You see, we can't really answer that from the knowledge, right? Now, you see, if it's unknown and it can't be answered from knowledge, it seems to call for something else. Which we have been calling perception of truth or insight. You see, now, and we've been going into the various kinds of thoughts which are getting in the way of that, which are part of our culture, and trying to get, perhaps we all are having some insight into this, you see, at some level, that it has some effect, but it will require a lot of work, you see, to really get into all that chemistry which holds the old way. And that's really the point I would like to put it at, that if you don't call it insight, you could call it perception of truth. And you see, we could raise the question of what is truth. It's a similar sort of, our culture has similarly produced a lot of confusion around there, which makes it hard to get into it, you see. You see, one theory of truth is that true ideas correspond to reality, right? Is that clear? That the true idea of the table would correspond to the reality of the table, but we've just seen that can't be, because every idea is a representation, which is an abstraction that leaves out most of the reality. It's hard to know what it corresponds to, you see. For example, if you take a map, if it's a correct map, does it correspond to anything in the country? You see, on the map are lines and dots representing cities. These are abstractions. These lines are not really lines. They're little, if you look at them carefully, they're little printed dots of ink, right, strung near each other. And similarly, the lines between the country don't exist either. They've been imagined by people. They may eventually be a fence there, but it was put up by people who thought there was a line there, you see. So there is a correspondence between one abstraction and another, right? Which guides you, you see, but it's a correspondence of form, certain abstract forms. Right? Now, but that is not. But then we say that, but it doesn't correspond. The reality itself escapes you. Every one of those things that corresponds, it doesn't stand by itself as reality. So the other, there may be a correspondence that kind. That's part of the correct idea. See, I would like to say that. Truth is something more. An idea may be correct or incorrect or somewhere in between, but truth is something deeper, you see. Now, so as to reserve the word truth for something deeper than that. That a correct idea will lead to not only to that kind of correspondence, but also to coherent action. Now truth. See, the word true. In English, its root means like a true line, straight, honest, and faithful, right? And in Latin, the word verus or veritas, verus is a root meaning that which is, and you see, so you could say it's straight, honest, and faithful to that which is. I mean, as a rough idea of truth, but you see, there will be no truth unless the mind is straight, honest, and faithful, unless it doesn't engage in self-deception, unless the chemistry allows it, you see. So there must be for truth to arise, there must be a certain situation in the brain.
In the Greek language, the word for truth is aletheia, which means out of lethargy.
Yes, out of sleep, yes. you have to be awake also for alert for truth. You see, in other words, truth requires a certain, what we may call state of mind, or really a state of the material system as well. And if the whole system is too jangled, you see, what happens, you can say, is the system is generally filled with all sorts of chemical effects of this incoherent thought, which interferes with perception and puts you to sleep and so on. You see, you could say the brain is filled with what I call electrochemical smog. And, and that has to be, when that is present, we don't have truth, you see. So now, the idea that there is an abstract truth somewhere, somehow, sitting there waiting for us to get hold of it, I think is again the same as the idea of the ultimate truth, the ultimate knowledge. You see that truth is something more vital. You see that it has to be that sort of movement which doesn't deceive itself and so on. And then it has to fit and cohere with that which is. But truth is a perception and it is simultaneously an action, right? The action of truth is to clear up that which is. It would clear up this electrochemical smog, right?
Pollution.
The pollution, yes. But it clears up the smog, as it were, so you see more clearly, and also the system isn't being poisoned and so on. So that's part of truth, you see. So truth is not merely information, you see, about what is, but rather truth is a key factor in what is, right?
How does truth relate to the unknown self revealing itself?
Well, the source of truth must be like insight, say, beyond what thought can grasp, right? And this truth comes and it touches the physical state of the brain, right? As well as producing the words which communicate it to thought. So so the point is now that truth is a factor in that which is. Truth is not just floating off there abstractly, but truth actually is, right? See, you see, namely, truth is a factor in actuality. Right? See, so when I said truth actually is, and the truth also meets that which is. It touches that which is in a coherent way when it touches what's going on in the brain and clears up some of it. And then from there on, it gives rise to a thought which can also act in a more coherent way. So
David,
yeah.
Are you separating truth from that which is?
From what?
That which is?
No, truth is a part of that which is, right? You see, and truth is a movement or an act within that which is, right? It actually is, right?
Can we say truth is the action and has its own actuality?
Yes, truth has its own actuality.
And truth lived would be life without reflex, then, in that.
Yeah, the truth is not a reflex, it is a creative perception.
So you would be living without the reflex.
But we need the reflex, but not dominated by the reflex. Yes.
Can an insight show me the truth, how my system works, where instead of fighting my system, I become friends with the system, where I disarm it without the system knowing I'm doing it, and the system is still there, but I'm aware how it works, and I can work beyond that towards truth.
Yeah. Well, something like that, but I'll put it like this, that the perception of truth, which is maybe in a flash of insight, actually changes the system to make it coherent, more coherent, right? And at the same time produces the words or whatever which communicate a new foundation for thought. Right?
Allow you need coherence to touch the truth?
Well, we need it. The brain has to quiet down and come. You see, this incoherence is the source of the electrochemical smog. You know, it means the brain is not in a condition. You see, if we fill the air with, our civilization has filled the air with smog, and the lungs are not in a condition to breathe properly sometimes. So, similarly, it's filled the brain with electrochemical smog, and it's not in a condition to respond to truth.
How does it respond to truth then?
It doesn't. You see it in a confused way, therefore it's not truth.
Is truth within the realm of description?
No, we're merely trying to paint, to give us sort of the words which would sort of point there. But it's an actuality, you see. It cannot be described, but it is an actuality which acts, right? The perception of truth is an actual act which changes things. It's not merely that it's the truth about something which is different. You see, there's also the truth of the false. You see, the false itself, the truth of the false is not only that it's false, but that the truth of the false is, say, it's electrochemical smog, it's a material process. So, therefore, there is some, ultimately underlying the false is the truth, right?
So truth is more like a bath?
Yeah.
So the false, it's a way of saying that the false lies only in abstraction.
Yeah.
And that,
yeah, you see that the false arises through inappropriate abstraction, to which leads to of a kind which leads to its own defense, right?
About the truth.
What?
The truth cannot be described.
No, we're not describing the truth. We're just saying some words which we hope are pointing. Right?
Yes. And here comes something else. Is the thinker and the word different from the thought?
Yes, well, that's another point, but I think, that's a long point. We might discuss that in the afternoon. You see that whether the observer and the thinker are different from the thought. It's already implied they're not, right?
Truth would be truth, absolutely truth, and would not be affected by time.
Yeah, but the truth would not be time, you see, because it would not even happen in time, you see, because if it takes time, meanwhile, see, part of the truth is, the action of truth is to, let's say, act on this smog, on this synapses to remove the incoherence, right? If it takes time, it won't be able to do that because, you see, it's changing all the time, and you see, the truth perception at one moment would not hold for the next, right?
And it's revealed in the absence of thought.
Yes, yeah.
Might it not be synonymous with beauty and joy?
Yes, it might be more or less the same area.
I was going to ask something along those lines, that a great work of art, of whatever genre, doesn't just have a correct representation of that which it is representing, but there's something, seems to be something more.
Yes.
And that I wondered if maybe that was true.
Well, in some way, yes, you see something like it. You see that there was something more of perception which goes beyond merely representing things. Though the representation may be there, but it's more than that. You see, just perhaps there was a perception of truth when the artist was painting it, you see, or doing it.
And that maybe that would be part of the reason why a very repressive kind of totalitarian system would also try and restrict and control art.
Well, I think they would control and restrict art, but almost anything. You see, they're controlling, restricting science to certain areas and so on. You see, to whatever areas they think. That they also use art, you see, just as they use science. But that would only be possible with freedom. I think we would have to bring in, which we don't have time for now, the question of freedom. But truth and freedom must be essentially one field, right?
But is truth similar to final knowledge?
Well, there wouldn't be knowledge, though, you see. See, truth is not, it acts from moment to moment, is what I'm trying to say. The truth is the action from moment to moment of...
Is it final knowledge in the moment?
Well, knowledge which is adequate fully to that moment, right? That's what I mean, right?
Explain why Einstein held imagination to be so superior to knowledge. I think...
Did he? I didn't know that.
Yes, he made a statement to the effect, if I'm recalling correctly, I'm going to be paraphrasing, that imagination has been infinitely more of service to humankind than is knowledge.
Well, if it's the creative imagination, then that's right, you see, because that has led to new perception, right? And to new action.
But since our culture represses that creative imagination in both the arts and sciences, we're in a double bind here.
Yeah, well, see, that's why we're going to have to discuss the culture. See, perhaps I'll just lay that foundation and we'll finish that. Perhaps we'll, the plan I was thinking of now is to discuss the culture and dialogue for the first part of the afternoon, and then go on to these other questions of observer and observed and time and so on to finish up on, which always makes a nice finish. And the point is that we have brought up the question of the society and the culture, which is suppressing all these things, which is creating all this smog. And the trouble is not originating in the individual primarily, nor is the individual able to handle it, you see, by himself, because even if he did, you would have still this whole culture doing it. It would have limited meaning, wouldn't it? So unless the whole culture is changed, it's not going to have all that deep a meaning. Although it will be important, even the individual change has tremendous importance. But so we're going to say that fundamentally the whole question of identity, self-image, repression, assumptions, and all that is arising in the culture, and which is shared meaning. We share all that, and it comes in, and we may reject some of it and accept some of it, but even that's part of the culture, you see, to be able to do that. And that's all the system, the culture underlies the system, you see. And so I think we'll begin the afternoon, if we may, by discussing the culture and how dialogue can be a way to begin to inquire into how the culture is operating in this field that we've been talking about. You see, that it's not enough to see ourselves happening in ourselves, because most of it happens between us, you see.
Can I ask a question? Or I had a thought a moment ago when you were talking about truth and insight. And there's a thing in mathematics called factorial. If you had three objects, then there's 1 times 2 times 3 permutations and combinations of ways that you can pick up things, which is 6. And if you have factorial 10, it's about 10 million. Now the brain has about 20 billion neurons where we do our imagination and our consciousness and our thinking. And if you took 20 billion and factorialized that, it would be a number for all intents and purposes which would be infinite. Well, that's an unlimited kind of state. And if the brain is in that state of silence where your conditioning and your thinking is not working, then there's an infinity or an unlimited quality about the brain, and it's in that state that it can be in communion or touched by the true nature of truth and insight, which is what you're talking about, which is an unlimited process. Maybe I just had the image or a picture in my mind that something like that happens when a person gets a flash of insight or in communion with truth. There's both states are in an unlimited, the brain and the true quality of truth is an unlimited thing. There seems to be some communication or something happening there, a spark or a flash.
Yeah, but then the brain, see, if it's really not conditioned deeply so that all these combinations are free to move around, then it can respond in infinity of ways and move in relation to truth, right? Yeah. Okay. Shall we finish then now?